I want to ask you something. When did you last intervene? And I don't mean the dramatic takeover at 30 feet when your colleague mistimes the flare. I mean something quieter than that. Because here's something I've come to realize. If you're a pilot of any experience at all, you've probably already intervened this week. Possibly today. You just didn't call it intervention. Maybe it was a comment on the downwind leg, a question about the fuel, a gentle observation about the profile that was, if you're honest about it, less of an observation and more of a hint. You probably called it CRM or situational awareness or just flying the aircraft together. But intervention isn't a dramatic last resort reserved for moments of crisis. It's something every pilot does on almost every flight. A spectrum of behaviours from the gentlest hint to the most decisive physical act that exists to keep the aircraft where it should be. In this episode, I want to show you what that spectrum actually looks like on a normal flight, including a moment where I had to take control close to the ground, how to move along it deliberately rather than reactively.
50.
Starting with a moment most pilots will recognise. You're flying downwind at a major airport. The arrival sequence is unusually quiet, no obvious traffic to worry about. But your colleague is still high and still fast, and something in your mental model is telling you that this isn't quite matching the picture. You don't say, "You're high and fast, what are you doing?" You say something like, "I guess we might be behind that traffic." Low-key, conversational. Technically, it sounds like a comment about sequencing, but what you're really saying is this: my mental picture doesn't match yours. I think we're in a position where if I were flying, I'd be lower and or slower. I'm not entirely comfortable, and I'm offering you a gentle prompt before I have to escalate. That is intervention. Specifically, it's the first step in the model. And there's something important to recognize here. Your mental model might well be wrong. Maybe there's traffic in the sequence that you hadn't accounted for. Maybe your colleague knows something you don't. That hint you offered wasn't just communication. It was also an invitation to explain their picture. Sometimes that conversation is the most valuable step in keeping the aircraft where it needs to be. Which brings me to the antidote to needing the intervention model in the first place: the briefing. Not a 2-minute checklist at top of descent, followed by robotic SOP callouts until the gate. The best pilots I've flown with have a quality that's genuinely hard to teach. They answer the questions in my head before I have them. If I know where you think we are in the approach, your plan, your constraints, your read of the traffic situation, I don't have to wonder what you're doing when the picture looks slightly off. I already know. That said, there's a balance to strike here. Sterile cockpit policies and procedures exist for good reason. Below a certain altitude, unnecessary conversation is a distraction, not an asset. And there is such a thing as a pilot who intervenes a little too often, a colleague who can't sit on their hands, who questions every call, who turns every approach into a committee meeting. The goal is relevance and timing, the right observation offered at the right moment in a way that opens a conversation rather than closing one down. The intervention model, then, exists for when the briefing hasn't effectively resolved the discrepancy. There is a model that was originally coined, I think, by Emirates, then since published in the IATA guidance material for improving flight crew monitoring. It has 4 steps: ask, suggest, direct, takeover. Ask is the gentlest entry point, an open question that surfaces the discrepancy without asserting it. What's your plan from here? Are we happy with the fuel at this point? You're inviting your colleague into a conversation about the picture. Suggest is a step further. I'd feel more comfortable a little lower here. How about we help it slow down by lowering the gear? You're putting something on the table. The decision is still shared. Direct is unambiguous. Go around. Now. Not a question, not a recommendation, a statement that requires a response. And the last and often most dramatic, takeover. Physical assumption of aircraft control. 2 things govern where you enter the model: aircraft state, time available. If everything is okay and there's time available, start with ask. If things are not okay, you don't work your way politely along the ladder. You go straight to the step the situation requires. That scenario on the downwind leg enters at ask because the aircraft state is fine and the discrepancy can be resolved with a conversation. A different scenario. You're approaching the flare. You've already said, "Flare?" No response. The aircraft state is rapidly becoming not okay, and you have about 2 seconds. You don't ask, you take over. There's a version of this conversation that frames intervention as something captains do to first officers, a tool for managing inexperience. I'd like to push back on that a bit. Every pilot in that flight deck, regardless of which seat they occupy, has both the right and the responsibility to intervene if the safety of the aircraft is being compromised. That includes the first officer intervening with the captain, not as a challenge to authority, as the fulfillment of it. The entire architecture of multi-crew operations is built on the premise that 2 qualified pilots, both engaged, both watching, both willing to speak up, produce better outcomes than one pilot operating alone. The first officer's engagement isn't a courtesy, it's the system working. This matters because there's a cultural pressure in cockpits, particularly in certain parts of the world, but everywhere to some degree, that treats the captain's decisions as beyond challenge. That pressure has contributed to accidents. It is the wrong model. The right model is one where the first officer is an active participant, not an observer. Which brings me to something I say to every new captain I work with, whether you've thought about it or not, whether you like the idea of it or not. You are now an instructor. The moment you upgrade to command, the person sitting next to you is watching your lead. Not just in the simulator, every time you go to work. First impression you make when you brief the cabin crew, the way you handle yourself when faced with an unexpected delay, whether challenge feels welcome on your flight deck or whether it quietly doesn't. All of it is being absorbed. You can be excellent or you can be mediocre at this job, and either way, you are teaching. The single most powerful thing you can do to reduce the need for late, stressful, high-stakes interventions is to create an environment where early, low-stakes intervention is normal, where the hint on the downwind is given and received naturally, where what's your plan from here is just a question, not a challenge. That environment is created in the briefing room. It's created in the first 10 minutes of the first flight of a trip. It's created by the tone you set before the doors closed, because the alternative is a flight deck where discrepancies simmer rather than surface, where the first officer hesitates when they shouldn't, and when the intervention that eventually happens is later and more dramatic than it needed to be. Let me tell you about a particular landing from a few years ago. I was in the left seat, we were on final approach. The approach had been fine. Nothing to suggest what was about to happen. Approaching the flare, I said, "Flare?" No response. I have control. On a normal day, what follows is clean. Hands come off the sidestick, you have control, pilot monitoring role assumed. The landing continues. What actually happened was, "No man, I got it!" Pilot sitting next to me was a highly competent operator. What happened next was not a reflection of his ability, it was the startle effect doing exactly what the startle effect does. It overrode conscious thought. It produced a reaction that felt correct to him in that fraction of a second, even though it wasn't. This is why the technique matters. I had pressed the button, and I was still holding it. On an Airbus fly-by-wire aircraft, if both pilots make sidestick inputs simultaneously, the aircraft adds both sidestick inputs together. Close to the ground, in a large aircraft with both pilots fighting for control of the same machine, the outcomes range from very bad to catastrophic. The reason that didn't happen is that I hadn't let go of the button. His inputs weren't reaching the control surfaces. The sidestick priority light was telling me he was still trying to fly the aircraft, and the button I was holding was ensuring that he couldn't. Press the button. Hold the button. Don't let go of the button until you are certain the handover is complete. The next thing I needed was for him to become my pilot monitoring, to transition out of the flying role and into the supporting role. What happened instead was that he put his head in his hands at about 120 knots on the landing roll. That is a human response. It's pride and surprise and the processing of something unexpected all happening at once in someone who cared deeply about doing their job well. But it meant that I was landing the aircraft alone. Be prepared for that. If you take over close to the ground, You may be flying as both pilots for the next 30 seconds. Plan for it. The landing will end. The aircraft will park, and then there will be silence. A takeover, even a correct one, even a necessary one, carries weight for the person to whom it happened. Their judgment was overridden in front of an aircraft full of passengers by the person sitting next to them. That hurts. It would hurt you too. The temptation, especially for a new captain, is to either over-explain or minimize. Neither works particularly well. What helps is empathy and honesty. Acknowledge what happened. Explain what you saw from your position with your information. Not as a defense, as an account. From where I was sitting, I wasn't seeing the horizon move. I had to make a call with the information I had. I may have been wrong, but that's the call I made. There is a version of that conversation you can have before the approach ever begins. During the pre-descent briefing with a first officer I haven't flown with before, particularly in training contexts, I include something specific. On an Airbus, there is no physical feedback from the other sidestick. I cannot know what you're doing on the controls unless I can see your hand, and I'm definitely not looking across at your hand at 40 feet. The Flight Crew Techniques Manual defines a late flare on an A350 or an A380 as anything initiated below 25 feet. So I agree something in advance. If I'm not seeing the horizon move by 30 feet, I have to assume the flare hasn't started. I can't know whether that's because it's being controlled perfectly in a way I can't perceive from my seat, or because something has gone wrong. So we agree beforehand that if that's what I see at 30 feet, I'm going to press the button. Not as a judgment of your flying, as a response to the information available to me at that moment. That conversation changes the nature of the event, if it ever happens. It's no longer a surprise, it's a pre-agreed response. It doesn't remove the sting entirely, but it changes the context. Context is most of what empathy requires. There's a version of intervention training that happens in the simulator, and it's valuable. We specifically train for it. Scenarios are designed around it. The intervention is the reason you're there. But it can never fully replicate what it feels like to take over on an aircraft. There's less at stake. You're hyper-aware that something is coming precisely because it's been set up that way. The startle effect is diminished. You're primed, not surprised. The real lessons are learned on the line, on unremarkable Tuesdays, in the small moments. The hint on the downwind, the question about the profile, the briefing that removes the need for any of those. Those moments are where the instincts are built. The simulator sharpens them. The line is where they form. Which leads, in the next episode, to the question of what happens when pilots stop forming them. What standards drift actually looks like from the inside, where the most dangerous version of it isn't the obvious failure. It's the slow, unnoticed slide away from the captain you were at your best. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this was useful, you know what to do. See you in the next one.